Welcome, traveler. Whether you've come here to unwind, to sleep, or just to escape for a little while, you're in the right place. This is your quiet corner of the ancient world, where myths unfold slowly, softly, and with just a hint of divine mischief. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, let the day go, because tonight we begin a war. The Trojan War did not begin with a battlefield. It began with an apple, not a weapon, not a prophecy. An apple tossed at a wedding by a goddess who wasn't invited. And that, believe it or not, is how it all starts. Tonight, we're going to unravel one of the oldest, most enduring stories in human history. Not just a war, but the war. The war that gave us Achilles' rage, Helen's beauty, Hector's courage, and the very first blueprint for what it means to be a hero, and to lose everything. This is the story of the Trojan War. We'll travel slowly from the petty divine squabbles that sparked it to the wooden horse that ended it. We'll meet arrogant kings, clever tricksters, doomed lovers, and very unhelpful gods. It's a tale of grief, pride, ego, glory, and destruction, woven together in bronze and fire. If you enjoy this kind of slow storytelling, myths told quietly, with care, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more ancient tales retold for restful nights. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Are you curled up in bed, watching the stars from your balcony? Leave a comment and let me know. I love seeing where these stories travel. Now then, take a breath. Let your shoulders relax. Let the fires of war flicker low on the horizon. Because before a single ship is launched, before the arrows fly or the gods choose sides, there is a feast, a wedding, a jealous goddess, and an apple. And the moment that apple lands, the fate of Troy is sealed. Let's begin. Before the war, before the rage, before even the whispers of Troy, there was a wedding. It was a grand event, the kind of gathering only the gods could afford to throw. Mount Pelion had been transformed into a banquet fit for immortals. Golden tables floated. Amphoras refilled themselves. The air was thick with ambrosia and absurd levels of divine ego. The bride, Thetis, was a sea nymph, beautiful, ethereal, and unfortunately, the subject of a troubling prophecy. The fates had murmured that her son would someday be greater than his father. This was enough to frighten even Zeus himself. No god wanted to risk being outshined by their own child. So Thetis was married off to a mortal, Peleus, a hero in his own right, but still very much human. A safe bet, the gods figured. Let the boy rise, just not too high. Everyone was invited. Well, almost everyone. At the edge of the celebration, standing just beyond the torchlight, was a figure no one had dared to include. Eris, goddess of discord. Not known for her social grace, she was left off the guest list entirely. Big mistake. She didn't shout. She didn't crash the party in a ball of fire. No, Eris was clever. Petty, yes, but clever. With a subtle flick of the wrist, she rolled a single golden apple across the banquet floor. On it, carved in perfect divine script, were 3 little words. To the fairest. That's it. That's all it took. The apple stopped at the feet of Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, 3 of Olympus's most powerful goddesses. Each glanced at it, then at each other, then back at the apple. Naturally, each assumed it was meant for her. Naturally, they were wrong, or right, or at least very willing to fight about it. To settle the matter, they turned to Zeus, who, perhaps sensing the trap, wisely declined to get involved. Instead, he punted the decision to a mortal, a young Trojan prince named Paris. living quietly in the countryside, unaware that the fate of empires was about to fall into his lap. The three goddesses descended upon him in full divine glory and began to bribe him. Hera offered him power. Athena promised wisdom and victory in battle. Aphrodite, smiling just a little too confidently, offered him love. Not just any love. The love of the most beautiful woman in the world. And Paris, being young and mortal and very much a romantic, chose her. He handed the apple to Aphrodite, and in that moment sealed the fate of his people, because the most beautiful woman in the world, she was already married. Her name was Helen, Queen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and Leda. Her beauty was said to defy logic. Poets would later write that she had the face that launched 1,000 ships, and they weren't exaggerating. She was married to Menelaus, king of Sparta, a powerful ruler, if not the most exciting man in the world. And then Paris showed up. With Aphrodite's blessing, Helen looked at this strange, golden-haired prince from faraway Troy, and, for reasons history has debated for centuries, she left. Did she fall in love with him? Was she enchanted? Did she flee a loveless marriage for a softer life? The myths aren't clear. They rarely are. But what they do agree on is this. One morning, Helen was gone, and with her, Paris had returned to Troy. Menelaus was humiliated, Sparta was outraged, and Greece was about to go to war. Here, the threads of the myth begin to knot. A wedding snub becomes an apple becomes a contest becomes an abduction, and an abduction becomes a cause. The gods had moved their pieces, the mortals had played their parts. Now the oaths would be called in, the kings summoned, the ships prepared. But this war, this enormous, glorious, tragic war, was not really about Helen. Not anymore. It was about honor, about legacy, about what happens when the proud feel slighted and the powerful feel owed. And in the distance, across the wine-dark sea, the walls of Troy stood tall and untouched. But not for long. Before Helen was ever taken, before Paris ever stepped foot in Sparta, her beauty had already caused trouble. She had many suitors, too many. Kings, princes, warriors. They all wanted to marry her, and they were ready to fight each other for the right. Her stepfather, King Tyndareus of Sparta, had a problem. No matter who he chose, the others would turn against him. His kingdom could erupt into civil war, all because of one girl. Then came Odysseus, clever, sharp-tongued, and not particularly interested in Helen himself. He had his eye on Penelope, Tyndareus' niece. In exchange for help securing her hand, he offered the king a solution. Odysseus proposed what would later be known as the Oath of Tyndareus. All of Helen's suitors would swear a sacred promise that no matter who married Helen, they would all come to his aid if anyone ever tried to take her away. A simple idea, a clever one, and, as it turned out, a curse, because when Helen sailed off with Paris, that oath was suddenly binding, and the men who had once competed for her were now honor-bound to go to war for her. Messengers were sent across Greece, to cities and islands, to mountains and coasts. The call to arms had begun. Among those summoned were the great names of the age: Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and brother of Menelaus, who took command as the general of the entire expedition; Nestor, the wise old king of Pylos, who had seen more battles than most had heard of; Ajax the Greater, towering and unstoppable, said to be second only to Achilles himself; Diomedes, young, bold, and fearless in battle; and of course, Odysseus, the man who had created the oath, now found himself trying to escape it. When the envoys came, Odysseus was living peacefully in Ithaca with his wife, Penelope, and their newborn son. He had no interest in leaving, so he feigned madness. When the emissaries arrived, they found him out in the fields, ploughing with an ox and a donkey, yoked together, sowing salt instead of seed. He muttered nonsense and ignored their questions. But the Greek envoy was clever too. They placed baby Telemachus in front of the plough. Odysseus swerved, and just like that, the ruse was over. He would go to war. There was one more name everyone wanted. Achilles, a prince of Phthia, a demigod, a warrior like no other. But Achilles' mother, Thetis, knew his fate. She had been told if her son went to Troy, he would never return. He would win glory, yes, but die young. So she hid him. She disguised Achilles as a girl and sent him to live among the daughters of King Lycomedes, hoping he'd be overlooked. But the Greeks were determined. Odysseus, ever the trickster, came to Lycomedes' court disguised as a merchant, bringing with him silks and jewelry, and, discreetly, weapons. He laid out the wares. The girls admired the trinkets, but one girl instinctively reached for a sword. In that moment, the disguise fell away. Achilles was revealed. And despite his mother's wishes, he agreed to join the war. He was promised glory, songs, immortality through legend. And Achilles, still young, still unbloodied, believed that would be enough. With the kings assembled and the warriors gathered, the fleet of Greece, over 1,000 ships, if the poets are to be believed, set out for Troy. But the gods were watching, and the gods had opinions. When the ships reached the port of Aulis, the winds died. The sea fell still. The sails hung limp. The goddess Artemis had been insulted by Agamemnon of all people, and she would not let the ships sail until she was appeased. Her price, the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia. It is one of the darker moments in the myth. Agamemnon lied to his wife, Clytemnestra, claiming he was bringing their daughter to Aulis to marry Achilles. But when Iphigenia arrived, there was no wedding. There was only the altar. Some versions say she was sacrificed. Others say Artemis took pity and replaced her with a deer at the last moment. We'll never know for certain. But the winds returned, and the ships set sail. And so, the great armada moved east, across the Aegean, toward the walls of Troy, toward a city that had not asked for war, but would become its stage. The Greeks carried more than weapons. They carried pride. They carried oaths. They carried the stories they wanted the bards to tell about them someday. And they carried the memory of a woman they claimed to fight for, though perhaps they had already forgotten what she looked like. Far across the sea, Troy stood waiting, not yet touched, not yet burned, but soon. The gods had chosen their sides. The mortals had played their hands, and the war, the real war, was only just beginning. For 9 long years, the war sat still. The Greeks had landed on Trojan shores with fury in their sails, but Troy, proud, walled, ancient Troy, refused to fall, and so the fighting dragged on, not in one great decisive clash, but in raids, ambushes, and drawn-out skirmishes. The Greeks made camp along the coast, building huts and trenches. Their ships were dragged ashore and left on the beaches like bones. Troy's great gates stayed shut. The land between the two armies became a graveyard of rusted bronze and bitter pride. Neither side would yield, neither could win. Inside Troy, life continued. Markets opened, children played. There were weddings, funerals, harvests. The city endured as cities do, even in war. But outside, under canvas tents and open sky, the Greeks grew restless. The promise of a quick, glorious war had faded. They were aging, they were hungry, and they were tired of the gods. Among the Greeks, no warrior was greater than Achilles. He fought like no one else. Unstoppable, golden, beloved by the gods. Where Achilles walked, victory followed. But even the strongest among them was not immune to insult. After a successful raid, Achilles claimed a woman named Briseis, a princess taken as a spoil of war, and whether he loved her or simply saw her as his rightful prize, what came next cut deep. Agamemnon, the High King and commander, had been forced to give up his own prize, a woman named Chryseis, to appease Apollo. And in his bitterness, he took Briseis from Achilles to make up for it. It was a fatal mistake. Achilles did not rage. He withdrew. He took his men, his myrmidons, and refused to fight. Without him, the Greeks began to falter. The greatest warrior in the world sat in his tent, silent and unmoving, as the war bled on without him. With the mortals growing weary, the gods grew bold. They had been watching, whispering, guiding hands unseen. But now they stepped down from Olympus and onto the battlefield itself. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon threw their weight behind the Greeks. They were still bitter from Paris's judgment, the golden apple he gave to Aphrodite. Aphrodite, naturally, sided with Troy, as did Apollo, whose temple had been dishonored, and Artemis, whose winds had once stilled the fleet. Zeus claimed neutrality, but he didn't hide his affection for the Trojans, especially for Hector, Troy's noblest son. What followed was not war, but chaos. Gods disguised as men, storms summoned from clear skies, armor enchanted, arrows redirected, entire duels swung by invisible hands. The battlefield became a divine playground, and the mortals, they were little more than pieces on the board. In Achilles' absence, another hero rose, Hector, Prince of Troy. He was no demigod, no invulnerable champion, but he was brave, loyal, fiercely human. He led his people with dignity and fought not for glory, but for home. While Paris lounged in the palace with Helen, Hector defended the walls. He challenged the Greeks again and again, pushing them back, threatening even their ships. In one legendary moment, he broke through the Greek lines and set fire to the very edge of their fleet. The war, which had once seemed so distant, now blazed at their doorstep. Still, Achilles did not return. Still, he sat in silence. The Greek army began to fracture. Without Achilles, they lost more than a warrior. They lost their morale, their unity, their sense of destiny. Odysseus pleaded. Phoenix wept. Ajax begged him to come back. But Achilles held firm. His pride, his sense of insult, outweighed every oath and plea. It wasn't until tragedy came to his own tent that everything changed. And when it did, the war would shift in ways no one could undo. Achilles had returned to battle, but the end of his path had already been written. His mother, Thetis, had known it all along. If he went to Troy, he would win undying fame and never come home. It happened near the end of the war. The details vary. Some say it was in a skirmish at the Scaean Gate. Others say it was an ambush, carefully planned. But the one constant is the archer, Paris, and the arrow. With Apollo guiding his hand, Paris loosed a single shaft. And though Achilles was clad in divine armor, the arrow found the one place left unguarded, his heel. The gods had dipped him in the Styx, but held him by that one small tendon. And there, the greatest warrior of his age fell, not in a blaze of glory, but from a single, quiet wound. Achilles' death sent a shiver through the camp. His body was recovered by Ajax and Odysseus, who carried him from the field. His armor, crafted by Hephaestus himself, became the prize everyone wanted. It was not just armor. It was a symbol, a legacy. Two warriors laid claim to it. Ajax, the mighty warrior whose strength was unmatched, and Odysseus, the clever tactician whose tongue was sharper than any sword. The Greeks held a vote. Odysseus spoke with eloquence. Ajax spoke from the heart, and in the end, the armor was given to Odysseus. Ajax, in shame and fury, fell into madness. Some say he slew animals in a frenzy, believing they were Greeks. When his mind cleared and he saw what he had done, he fell on his own sword. Thus, even in death, Achilles scattered tragedy. The war dragged on. 10 years had passed. Still, the walls of Troy stood. The Greeks turned to oracles, prophecies, signs. They were told they could not win unless 3 conditions were met. They must recover Philoctetes, the archer abandoned years ago, whose bow had once belonged to Heracles. They must bring Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, to Troy. They must steal the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena hidden within Troy's walls. Each task was difficult. Each was fulfilled. Philoctetes returned, bitter, wounded, but still deadly. Neoptolemus came, young and ruthless, a shadow of his father. And Odysseus, ever the trickster, crept into Troy in disguise and stole the Palladium. And yet, the city still stood, until Odysseus had one final idea. It was not a weapon, not a storm, not a divine curse. It was a horse, massive, hollow, made of wood. Odysseus proposed building it as a gift, an offering to Athena. The Greeks would pretend to sail away, leaving the horse behind as a tribute and surrender. But inside the horse, he and a handful of warriors would hide. The rest of the Greek army would wait, just out of sight. And so they built it, tall enough to brush the gates, strong enough to hold men within. They left it outside Troy, and they vanished. Troy rejoiced. After 10 long years, the Greeks were gone. Their tents were burned. Their ships vanished. The horse stood as a monument to their victory. Some advised caution, others celebration. Cassandra, the daughter of Priam, warned them. She had seen a vision. She always did, and no one ever believed her. Laocoon, a priest, cried out, "Beware the Greeks, even bearing gifts," and threw his spear at the horse. But then, 2 great sea serpents emerged from the waves and strangled Laocoon and his sons. The Trojans saw this as a sign. The gods wanted the horse brought in. The gates opened. The horse was wheeled inside. The city celebrated long into the night. And when they slept, the trap was sprung. At midnight, the belly of the horse opened. Odysseus and his men crept out, silent and swift. They opened the gates, and the Greek army, waiting in the darkness, stormed in. What followed was not war. It was massacre. The city burned, palaces crumbled, temples fell. Priam was slain at the altar. Hector's son was thrown from the walls. Cassandra was dragged from the temple of Athena, clutching the statue, her prophecy fulfilled and ignored one final time. Helen was found, and Menelaus, blade in hand, looked into her eyes and could not kill her. Troy, ancient Troy, fell to ash and shadow. The war was over. But the story was not. Aeneas, a Trojan prince, escaped the flames carrying his father on his back and his son by the hand. He would wander west toward Italy, and his descendants would one day build Rome. Odysseus, despite his cunning, would spend 10 long years lost at sea before seeing his home again. Agamemnon would return to a wife who had not forgotten Iphigenia. And Helen? She went back to Sparta. But nothing, truly, went back to how it was. Because no one wins a war like this. Not really. And so, That is the story of the Trojan War. Not a clean story, not a story of good versus evil, but a story of pride, grief, longing, and loss. A war that began with a wedding, with a goddess left off the guest list, with an apple. And from that small slight grew a decade of blood and ash. Heroes rose, cities burned, and the world shifted just a little. We remember the war because the poets would not let it die, because Homer sang of it, because artists painted it, because somewhere deep down, we recognize these people. We've all known someone like Achilles, brilliant, proud, and wounded. We've all heard a Cassandra speaking truth no one wants to hear. We've all seen kings make foolish choices in the name of ego. And maybe that's why it stays with us, even now. So if you're still here, thank you. Thank you for walking quietly through this story with me, for letting it unfold slowly, for letting it live again gently in your imagination. Sleep well, traveler, and dream gently. The war is over,